This class is entitled The Inner Nature of Faith. That title is from one of the books by a friend of mine who's now deceased. Jim Araj was his name. It's a wonderful book, The Inner Nature of Faith. So if you like this topic and you're looking for a good, rich read on it, you can get it from the Araj website, which is innerexplorations.com. And they have lots of good resources there as well on theology and spirituality, a wealth of things. Good, solid material. That's inner, it's just like it sounds, inner, I-N-N-E-R, explorations with an S, .com. Araj is A-R-R-A-J. So he died in 2009, and so his influence lives on, including in this class. So we remember Jim as we begin. Just to backtrack a little on some earlier topics that will lead into today's definitions of spirituality, false self-system, and so forth. We've talked about spirituality in general. A general definition is the process of developing the life of the human spirit in its openness to ultimate meaning, truth, and goodness. The human spirit we talked about in distinction from our psychological nature and our physical nature, as including the life of the intellect, including intuition as part of that, the life of the will, conscious awareness. So spirituality is about how we use that part of our nature in openness to meaning, truth, and goodness. That was our first class. Christian faith, then, as the openness to and entrusting belief in the providential care and guidance of God as revealed and mediated through the person of Jesus Christ. We touched on that last time, and we'll go much more into that this time. But openness to and entrusting belief, you see how that resonates really with what we're talking about in spirituality. Spirituality is developing the life of the Spirit in its openness to meaning, and we're finding in Christian spirituality and Christian faith that meaning in the person of Jesus Christ, centered and rooted in Him. So Christian faith obviously has an orientation to Christ, which is what makes it Christian faith rather than another kind of faith. Christian spirituality, then, is spiritual development in the context of Christian faith. So there's, again, this explicit reference to Jesus Christ and intentional practices to cultivate relationship with Jesus through His modes of presence to us. And in the second class, we talked about those modes of presence to us as His personal historical presence, which we encounter through the Scriptures and our reflection and study of the Scriptures. His presence to us mediated through human relationships, especially His presence in the Christian community. His presence to us sacramentally with small and big S sacramental celebrations, and His presence to us in the cosmos, in the larger experience we have of creation, culture, other religions, and so forth. Again, this is all backtracking. You would have it from earlier handouts. Last class we dealt with the false self-system, how sin and non-love has wounded us and biased our spiritual development. A few points we made there about the false self-system and spirituality. That the false self-system engenders or moves us to a mentality of salvation by works, that we have to do something to get love. Even in the religious realm, we have to do something to get God's attention and God's love. The ego, part of ourselves, where we experienced our center of identity, our decision-making process, our reason, knows itself more in terms of self-image than through realization of self and consciousness of grace. There's a vulnerability to evil spirit that comes with the false self-system, enmeshment in what Scripture calls the world, which is not the creation, but how the culture itself has taken on the values of the false self-system and mirrors that back to us. idolatry of attachments and addictions, all those things we tell ourselves we need in order to be happy that end up functioning as idols of sorts. And so that's sort of the context for today's presentation on faith. What do we mean by faith? So we begin with this very simple understanding of faith. Faith as exercising the human spirit to open the mind and will to the influence of grace. Okay? It might help here to put yourself in God's position. Something we don't often do, I know. Say you're the creator, and you've nurtured the creation of the planet Earth, and you've seen things come along to the emergence of human beings, and then there's this huge disappointment that human beings begin to misuse freedom and create all sorts of problems among themselves and nature. And there's a growing weight of sin, what we call sin, in the world as history rolls along. These traditions of non-love become deeply enculturated. Biases of all kinds stunt our human growth. You're a loving God. You want to do something about it. What do you do? How do you do this? You can say, well, one option is to unmake human beings. Wipe the whole thing out. Let's start over. Well, that was not the option God took. It seems that God says, well, they still have intelligence. They still have freedom. I'm going to appeal to that, which makes them distinctly human. But I'm going to have to really take things to another level in my appeal to them, because what I'm presenting to them through nature and just through the goodness that is there in the creation doesn't seem to be enough to counter this growing weight of sin in the world. So God does appeal to that, to the mind and the will, and faith is, in a sense, our response, our using our mind and our will to respond to that call of God. Faith can also be understood as openness to relationship with God. Without faith, then, we aren't really open to God, to relationship with God. Faith can be understood as entrusting one's life to God's providential care. So trust is more something we do with our will, right? Yeah. You ever tell someone that you love them, but you don't trust them? Is it possible to love someone but not trust them? It certainly absolutely is, isn't it? Or to tell someone you forgive them, but you don't trust them. Absolutely. Trust is a whole different kind of a thing. And so faith engages us at the level of trust, which is a very deep level. When we trust someone with that deep part of our lives, what Scripture calls the heart, we're really letting them in a very deep place. Faith entails belief and surrender. Then you can't really grow in faith unless you become clear about your beliefs. Faith is not the same thing as beliefs. People can have beliefs without a very deep faith and trust, but it's hard to grow in faith without beliefs. Faith, we said last time too, is a gift from God. It's not possible to experience without God's offer of relationship. Let's look then at several different types of faith or levels of faith. We've sort of been focused on religious faith so far, but we need to recognize that there are other levels of faith at work in the world as well. First, there's what we might call humanistic faith. All right, humanistic faith. Here, first of all, we're going to look at three things: faith level, call, and response. Humanistic faith recognizes that every one of us experiences a call to growth and wholeness in our lives. We hear that call through the suffering and discontent that we experience in our lives. It comes through there. Suffering is sort of a way sometimes of telling us that we're not properly adjusted to our situation. It's the red light blinking on the dashboard of our consciousness saying, problem, problem, change needed, change needed. And so in response to that, we can study our situation, we can learn new attitudes, learn new behaviors, and we can adjust our lives. There is a call that comes through the experience of wonder and mystery, a call to live life fully. There is a call that comes through the voice of conscience, which every human being has, an inner openness to doing what is right in the moment, an inner openness to how the Spirit guides us in our lives to make good, sound moral choices. And if we respond to those kinds of calls, we become open to change and to grow and to search for truth and meaning. And we come to a fidelity of conscience. Now, there are some people whose faith development seems to be mostly on this level, and we call them humanists. They don't necessarily believe in God, but they do believe that moral living is important. They do believe that the search for meaning is important. And they are people who are striving to, with their human spiritual consciousness, to live authentically. So we might even say that this struggle to live authentically is at the heart of humanistic faith. So is it a bad thing to be a humanist? No. It just seems to be very difficult to be completely happy as a humanist, because there are very important questions, ultimate questions, that are being ignored. The psychiatrist Jung alluded to that when he said, among all my patients in the second half of life, that is to say, over 35, there has not been one whose problem in the last resort was not that of finding a religious outlook of life. It is safe to say that every one of them fell ill because they had lost that which the living religions of every age have given to their followers, and none of them has really been healed who did not regain his religious outlook. Carl Gustav Jung, psychiatrist who treated many, many, many people, recognizing the importance of a religious spiritual dimension in the service of healing. Another level of faith that has to do with belief in the Creator entails recognition of a Creator, and it goes beyond humanistic faith. We hear that call in the questions that we have that occur within ourselves about ultimate cause, ultimate meaning. When a little child will ask a question, where did everything come from? That is kind of an early example of that. Recognizing that there's power and meaning and truth beyond our own opinions, this intuition of transcendence, of a truth that is within but also outside myself, to which I am accountable. Called by recognizing the order of the universe and how did this order come about. Theistic faith entails recognition of a Creator and the duties toward the Creator that we experience, usually mediated through a religious community or tradition. This type of faith constitutes one as a religious person, one who recognizes a higher authority and purpose to life. One who has theistic faith can say, there is a God to whom I will have to give an accounting of my life. That is sort of a minimal statement that a person who has theistic faith can make. The theological or philosophical position called deism is a minimal position here. Deism is the belief that God created the universe but isn't particularly involved with it. We connect with God by studying the lawfulness of the universe and learn to align ourselves according to that lawfulness and to recognize in our belief and in our meditation the Creator of everything, to whom we will have to give an accounting of our lives. Theistic faith goes through grows through meditation and study, humility and worship, and moral living. It's largely focused on developing the life of the mind, the will as well, but much more so the mind. Theistic faith is something that can be taught, and universities teach it, churches teach it, and so forth. And one can give consent to this kind of faith as well by agreeing with the propositions that are being presented. Now there's another level, we call it theotic, and you remember that third class I presented on theosis, which means our God process, spiritual transformation. And by the way, you might take a look at our jug of wine back there, which was our prop for that class, the symbol we were using, theotic faith being symbolized in the Gospels by fermenting wine and leavening bread and so forth. So it's getting more clear. Theotic faith takes theistic faith a step deeper. It goes even deeper. The call is to inner transformation and new life, not simply belief, not simply acknowledging the Creator. It calls for this inner transformation that is a rebirth in spirit and a dying to the false self, tentacles that go all the way deep into our unconscious. It entails letting go of attachments and addictions and growing in the Spirit. You might say it includes everything that theistic faith includes and everything that humanistic faith includes, but it takes it to a much deeper level. People with theotic faith are developing their sense of relationship with God and belonging to God. They are experiencing something of the mystical dimension of their religious tradition. Some people in a religious tradition don't seem to go very far down this pathway. It's enough to believe, to belong to the community, to live a good and moral life. And some transformation is happening, to be sure. But they're not consciously committed to a theotic spiritual pathway. Okay? So then, is it possible to be into humanistic growth to the exclusion of theistic and theotic, in the sense that I just have spoken of them? Is it possible to be into theistic growth to the exclusion of humanistic and theotic? And finally, is it possible to be in theotic transformation to the exclusion of theistic and humanistic? So we'll spend a little time at the table talking about that, just letting you process what I was talking about with that table. And this will be a way that we kind of come to grips with it a little more among ourselves, okay? I'll check back with you in a few minutes. Well, looks like you're having fun with this. In truth, it seems that the boundaries between these three different kinds of faith are somewhat permeable, aren't they? That one can move into the other. They're different, and you can see, examples. Certainly we had many at our table where people seem to be kind of attached to one to the exclusion of the others. What was your thought about that third question? You think it's possible to be into theotic transformation to the exclusion of theistic and humanistic? That's the hardest one, isn't it? Because if you're really going to get into inner transformation, first of all, you have to have at least some kind of religious faith. And also you have to be willing to confront your inner life as well. How many of you thought that you could be into theistic to the exclusion of the other two? And you've probably seen some examples of that. People, who are really strong in their religious beliefs, but aren't willing to take a look at themselves, aren't willing to go very far into, let's say, their psychological issues and transformation, and or spiritual transformation. I've had pastors who were spiritual directees who were so frustrated with their congregation because they weren't interested in learning more about prayer or spiritual transformation or joining a spiritual growth group or something like that as well. They believe the right things and they're trying to live a good life, and so don't bother me with anything else, was sort of the attitude. Then there are the humanists, good people, some of whom do not want to be bothered with the question of God. You know, you think of some examples of that. There are some very prominent examples of that. Atheists and agnostics, who are people who promote good, healthy, humanistic values, care for the earth, social justice, and so forth, but closed completely. Think of this atheist, Richard Dawkins, as an example of that. Christopher Hitchens was another, but he died a few years ago. Okay, so there's these questions. Okay, zeroing in a little more into the dynamics of religious faith, we're going to be talking about both theistic and theotic here. These remarks are adapted somewhat from Newman's masterpiece, John Henry Cardinal Newman, The Grammar of Assent, which is all about faith. It's kind of a classical work on faith. Newman identified two aspects of faith, and we're talking here about explicit faith, faith that is conscious of itself, not a more implicit faith, which we referred to last time. Newman referred to a consent of the intellect and a consent of the will. Now, last time, too, we talked about the 12 steps, and so if you want to make that connection, Newman's first movement, consent of the intellect leading to belief, more or less corresponds with step 2 of the 12 steps. Step 2, as you may recall, reads, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Coming to believe is something that we do with our minds. And if we grasp a hold of that kind of a belief, then we have hope. It gives us a sense of hope that a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity. I'm not stuck. So there's this connection between belief and hope in step 2. This kind of belief, consent of the intellect, places one in the realm of theistic faith. To know what one believes about God and why, there must be a conversion of the mind. And this is emphasized in Christian spirituality. It stresses the importance of study, adult education, theology, images of God, theodicy issues, which are really sticky. Theodicy refers to the branch of theology that deals with the problem of evil and suffering. The core question, how can a good God allow suffering and evil to happen? Well, the mind has to grapple with these questions. And Scripture provides us a wonderful repository of truth and reflection on those issues. There are a variety of values that flow from this consent of the intellect. We become more clear to ourselves about what kind of a God is God, what God expects of me. Not absolutely clear, but somewhat clear. Clear enough to be able to answer that question for ourselves. And that knowledge engenders in us, again, this hope that there is truth beyond my own opinion that I can base my life on. There is meaning beyond my own desires that I can focus my life on. There are standards that I can live by that will bring me peace. Sometimes in life, in my experience for sure, intellectual belief is all I've got. Maybe you've been to that place where emotionally things aren't happening. Energetically, things aren't happening. Volitionally, I'm ready to give up, but I still believe. And so this consent of the intellect attunes us to the issue of truth And remember what Jesus said about truth. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And so I hold myself accountable to that. So even if I don't feel like it, quite the opposite, even if I'm discouraged, I still believe, and I will act on that belief. And then once you begin to move in that direction, things usually start to get better. The second movement of faith, and these often happen concurrently, is the consent of the will leading to surrender, belonging, and relationship. It corresponds with step 3 of the 12 steps. I'm not sure Bill W. knew that he was doing this when he wrote the 12 steps, but consider the language of step 3. Made a decision to turn our life and will over to the care of God as we understand Him. What are we turning over to God's care? Our life and our will. So that's a different kind of surrender than the formation of the mind. It's a movement from belief to belonging, from conceptual convictions to relational experience. It puts us in an attitude of being in relationship. God is one that we are in relationship with. We are now open to knowing God as a God of love, for love comes through the will, more so than the mind. Okay, questions about Newman's two movements? I just found it so interesting. I was familiar with Newman's work, and the first time I read the steps, I said, well, by golly, he's trekking right along Newman's work there, which means they probably had the same teacher, don't you think? Yes. Coming to faith is a whole other question. How do people come to faith? I remember in staff meetings when I worked at the Spiritual Life Center, we would ask ourselves at times, who are the people who are coming here, who are coming to our programs? And it looked like they were generally people whose lives had fallen apart and who had found God as the one who helped put their lives back together. And now they desperately needed to stay in touch with God for their own sanity. And then there were people who had just gotten excited about God sometime in their lives. Their lives hadn't necessarily fallen apart, but they wanted to grow in that relationship. The rest weren't interested in what we were doing at a retreat center. They still aren't. People whose lives have fallen apart and discovered their need for God, and people who had in some way fallen in love with God. Now, William James, in a wonderful book called The Varieties of Religious Experiences, have any of you read that book? Oh my goodness. Put it on your reading list, on your bucket list, sometimes before you die. Read William James' Varieties of Religious Experience. It's still a classical work on the topic. I don't think anything better has ever been written. One distinction he made was between once-born types and twice-born types. It's a fun book because he has a lot of anecdotal material in there, a lot of people he interviewed. Once-born versus twice-born. And no, I'm not moving into a sort of an evangelistic proselytizing, are you born again thing. That's a different kind of language there. Once-born people are what he called healthy-minded. In a religious context, faith for them has been, in a sense, always there, as long as they can remember, and has grown gradually. Their lives have never really completely fallen apart. Psychologically, we might say their ego has evolved and stretched and developed without significant deconstruction. Conversion for them has been a gradual, ongoing process. These are not necessarily shallow people. They have experienced suffering, deep shifts, perhaps profound grief, significant growth experiences. But they're once born in the sense that their lives have never really fallen apart. Then there are twice born people. James called these people who experienced a sick soul. Their soul has been rejuvenated through spirituality or religious experience. The song Amazing Grace gives testimony to such a person. Bill W.'s experience of conversion in a hospital is another one, and I'm going to share that now. What happens with these twice-born people is, I like to call it the Humpty Dumpty syndrome. If you think of Humpty Dumpty as their ego being that conscious aspect of our personality that structures our lives and mediates our conscious experience, Humpty Dumpty at some point falls off the wall. And what happens to Humpty Dumpty? You remember the rhyme? All the king's horses and all the king's men can't put Humpty Dumpty together again. Neither can alcohol, neither can drugs, neither can anything put Humpty Dumpty together again. He's broken. He's shattered. He's lost it. And so God puts it back together in second-born types. Here's Bill W.'s accounting of it, and I share it because, again, of our connection with 12-step spirituality. Bill Wilson was a stockbroker, a chronic alcoholic, in late-stage alcoholism, probably dying of the disease in 1934 when he went to Towns Hospital in New York. And I pick up his account here. My old friend, Dr. William Silkworth, shook his head. Soon free of my sedation and alcohol, I felt horribly depressed. My friend Ebby, who was always trying to convert him, turned up, and although glad to see him, I shrank a little as I feared evangelism, but nothing of the sort happened. After some small talk, I again asked him for his neat little formula for recovery. Quietly and sanely and without the slightest pressure, he told me and then left. Now, Ebby was again, a sort of evangelical Christian who believed that if you surrender to God, even your alcoholism, you could get well. Lying there in conflict, I dropped into the blackest depression I had ever known. Momentarily, my prideful depression was crushed. I cried out, now I am ready to do anything to receive what my friend Ebby has. Though I certainly didn't expect anything, I did make this frantic appeal. If there be a God, will he show himself? The result was instant, electric, beyond description. The place seemed to light up, blinding white. I knew only ecstasy and seemed to be on a mountain. A great wind blew, enveloping and penetrating me. To me it was not of air, but of spirit. Blazing, there came the tremendous thought, you are a free man. Then the ecstasy subsided. Still on the bed, I now found myself in a new world of consciousness, which was suffused by a presence, one with the universe. A great peace came over me. I thought, so this is the God of the preachers. This is the great reality. Now, he didn't live the rest of his life in ecstasy, but it was a profound turning point for him. A twice-born religious experience. He was literally reborn in that moment in the spirit and never drank again, and went on to become one of the great spiritual teachers of the 20th century. I really believe that. 12-step spirituality and the reflections around that are a tremendous gift to the human race, that Bill Wilson, this alcoholic dying in bed, was awakened and transformed to share with the human race. The call in both cases is to ongoing consent of the intellect and will, are essential for both. After Bill Wilson had this rebirth experience, he had moments of darkness and doubt. He had that experience to remember and to go back on. In one sense, faith is this remembering in darkness what we have seen in the light. And so faith can even touch our memory in that sense. He had to learn how to walk in the Spirit. Being born again is one thing, walking in the Spirit is another. Okay, so then biblical faith. Biblical faith encompasses both once-born and twice-born types. So it's not just for sin-sick souls, it's for everyone. Jesus says he didn't come to call the healthy, just the sick. Well, he had friends who were on the healthy side too. So he came for everyone. Biblical faith is, of course, theistic and theotic. At the heart of biblical faith, the context for the call and response aspect of faith is the covenantal perspective. And so covenant is the context for the Judeo-Christian theistic and theotic approaches to spirituality. And at the core of it is a God who calls individuals into community to be family with God. Covenant is contrasted with contract, which we know a lot about. It's common in our culture. Contract is an exchange of goods or services based on self-interest. You do this for me, I do this for you. When one or both of our interests are no longer met, we cease to be in contract. And there are terms for violating the contract. Covenant, however, is an agreement that binds people together in a relationship of trust. It's very common in the Middle East still, families, tribes covenanting to form alliances. Covenant is usually sealed with a sacrifice of some kind. A common one would be splitting the carcass of an animal and walking on the blood, which is where the term standing on the blood comes from. Did you know that? What's implied is if either one of us breaks this covenant, then let what has happened to this animal happen to that one. Then there is the burning of the animal, which is an offering to God. In doing so, these covenanting parties become family to one another. Your people become my people. They can still intermarry if they're from different genetic lines, of course. But the understanding is what someone does to your family, they do to mine. If another tribe attacks your family, they attack mine as well. Covenant also entitles one to the goods of the family. Now consider doing that with God. In the case of human tribes, land, cattle, food, etc., to be apportioned by the family or clan leaders as they decide. It also binds the families to a certain code of ethics, to act as one who belongs to this family, and to have pride in that. It's possible to be disowned or forfeit the belonging if the behavior is particularly offensive. The behavioral codes are understood, they are communicated, they're reinforced and celebrated. Now that's the context for our biblical tradition, is this kind of understanding of covenant. The movement from Genesis to the Gospels is a movement from a theistic to an increasingly theotic covenant, and we'll review that in a minute. Through it all, the humanistic perspective is affirmed. Creation is a good thing. Human nature is a good thing, including our psychological nature. There is sin, which subverts our best intentions, but we are not intrinsically evil. God, who is good, is our creator. Covenant asks us to take seriously, and this is the core thing for Christians to realize, I believe, in a world where we're becoming more multiculturally aware, even of the fact that God is involved in other religious traditions. What we're being asked to take seriously is that for some reason, a small group of Middle Eastern people, the Hebrews, had this idea that no less than God was calling them into a covenantal relationship. That God is going to deal with the problem of the growing weight of sin in the world by revealing God's self to them and communicating God's life to them in a very unique and intimate way that would empower them and transform them, a way they could never figure out on their own. And so it required God to take the initiative. And the Bible is, in a sense, the story of that call and response. Not always a faithful response, as we know. A relationship that developed through time with deeper intimacy, belonging, and clarity of rights and duties along the way. It begins with Noah and his family, who are saved from the flood. There's a prohibition of homicide and drinking blood, sacrificial blood. God promises not to destroy humanity with a flood, and what is the sign of that covenant? A rainbow. Then there's the next level, the covenant with Abraham. Takes things another notch. God chooses Abraham to be the father of many. There's ritual described, celebrated, circumcision as a sign of this covenant. The covenant with Moses at Sinai, a step deeper. God leading God's people out of slavery and forming them into a more intimate relationship with him. There is given knowledge of the divine name, knowledge that enables you to call on someone. There are rituals to celebrate the covenant. There's the Ark of the Covenant. There is the law. There is the Davidic covenant and the promise of a Messiah and unbroken dynasty. And all of these covenants take in or subsume those that came before. Covenant is updated here through David, through promises made to Jeremiah and Isaiah about the outpouring of the Spirit, and of course finally in Christ. The covenant that God brings to us initiates through Jesus Christ, which we call the New Covenant, which is the context for Christian faith. The call in this New Covenant is a call to be in relationship with Christ in Christian community. Christ is the one who has effected this new level of covenantal belonging between God and the human race. Christ is the one who makes it possible for us to be, through sharing his own Spirit, members of the Trinitarian family. We stand with Christ in the Trinity, participating in the flow of Spirit that he experiences. Now that, my friends, is intimacy. That is the call, is to become covenanted with God, members of the family of the Trinity. Community is a mode of Christ's presence where this flow of Spirit can be experienced. The response to this call, faith, as we have discussed it all along, belief and so forth, an entrusting of one's life to Christ, an acceptance of the gift that he has come to bring, even if we don't fully understand it. There are ways that God is dealing with evil in Christ and his crucifixion that are very deep and profound mysteries. And we really only fumble when we try to articulate theologies about that, substitutionary atonement, satisfaction, and so forth. Ways we try to get at that, but there's a very deep mystery going on there. Baptism is the sacrament where we celebrate our coming to belong to God's people as well, not to the world system, not to the false self system that is enculturated in the world. To be a follower of Christ then means to become a member of the community of believers who also follow him. It means to be blessed as well with his Spirit, the very same Spirit that he used in his ministry, that Spirit that grasped him and ministered in and through him, we are gifted with as well. We remember Christ's sacrifice and celebrate our covenantal belonging to God and each other in the Lord's Supper, where Christ feeds us with his risen life. And I know different Christian traditions celebrate that in different ways. This is all very religious talk, isn't it? And indeed it is. We are not dealing with humanistic faith here. Christian faith is religious, profoundly theistic, profoundly theotic, with these covenantal considerations forming an overarching context for our spirituality. Many people today want spirituality without religion. They want to be spiritual without being religious. Some Christians even want to be followers of Jesus without being members of a Christian community. But all spirituality operates in the context of certain theological assumptions about who God is, what human nature is like, and how God and human beings interact. You cannot avoid this. Anyone who says they are spiritual but not religious has ideas about God. don't they? Where do those ideas come from? How do they know that those ideas are worthy? One needs to find where one belongs in Christian community, and this can be a challenge. For many people have been hurt in Christian community by even their leaders, sad to say. But as someone has told me many times, my own spiritual director through the years, it's a very big church. Find where you belong in it. There is a place for you somewhere in the church. Okay, closing comment from Jim Mirage. In his book, all of this can leave us with the impression that faith is a complex matter, best left to the deliberations of theologians. This is not true. In fact, faith resists our intricately woven nets of concepts because of its simplicity and depth. And in virtue of this simplicity, it permeates our lives like the air we breathe. We think God is absent because we do not find him like one object among all the others, when all the time he is there within us as our deepest goal. We are continually being drawn by this mysterious, powerful, silent call to union with God. It is faith which is our response to this hidden inner presence. At any moment, in any place, we can go on the journey of faith, for it is that tiny, quiet reaching out with our heart to God that is the essence of faith. Would you like that?